Ladies and gentlemen, the session is about to begin. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin shortly. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the moderator for our second plenary on education, Quandary, the founder of Trace and True Africa, Claude Grunitzky.
Education is a human right. It can be a powerful driver of development and one of the strongest instruments for reducing poverty, improving health, and promoting gender equality. However, education in the Southern Atlantic region is still not meeting its population's expectations. Education policies must shift from promoting numbers of schools and of children in school to promoting learning. What are the skills needed to promote sustainable development and ensure employability? How can we ensure that education meets the aspirations of children and of their parents? How can education better drive long-term economic growth, spur innovation, strengthen institutions, and foster social cohesion? Is online education the new paradigm in learning?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage for our second plenary on education Quandary, the founder of Trace and True Africa, Claude Grunitzky.
Hey. Thank you so much for being here. This is a really important panel because education is the key to happiness, it's the key to success, it's the key to prosperity. And it's such an honor for me to be on this stage again this year. Last year, I led a discussion on culture, which is extremely important, but I would even argue that education is even more important, and that's one of the things that we need the most in Africa. In my part of West Africa, Francophone West Africa, half of 6-year-olds cannot read or write. I'm from Togo, and this is something that we need to change, not just in Francophone West Africa, but everywhere on the continent. And as we start engaging in this dialogue about the global South, it is such a great honor for me, Claude Grunitzky, to be introducing this all-star panel that we have today. And so it is my pleasure to welcome actually one of my heroes, Ezekwesili, who's the former Minister of Education in Nigeria, to this stage. Please welcome Obi. A big round of applause. We have another luminary, and she's actually coming not from my part of West Africa, but actually from France. If you can sit here, Obi, it would be wonderful. We have Najat, Vallaud Belkacem as well. So now we have, who's a former Minister of Education of France. So now we have 2 former Ministers of Education on the stage. That's how we roll. And then I have my fellow countryman, Didier Acouetey, who's the founder of AfricSearch. He has been spotting talent all over the continent and globally. And I'm proud to say that I've known this man since we were just chill kids. So it's great to be on stage with you, Didier. Welcome. Okay. And last but not least, we have Gregory Nguyen, who is another former minister from Vietnam. And please welcome, he's now teaching economics at Howard University in Washington. So as you can see, we have a pretty good representation of the global South. And we're going to jump straight into it because the numbers don't lie, and the numbers are actually really, really scary. We have a brain drain issue in Africa, as you know. It's great that this conference is taking place here in Morocco on the African continent, but just one statistic that will be sobering to many of us who care about the future of Africa, the brain drain is real. We have 1 out of 9 people who actually return to Africa to work. And if you compare that with Latin America, it's actually only 1 out of 13. And if we compare Africa to Asian countries, it's 1 out of 30. So we have a problem with brain drain in Africa. The best and brightest are not wanting to work on the continent. They're not wanting to sacrifice what they need to sacrifice in order to grow these economies. And I'm just going to jump straight into it, Obi. Why do you think we're in this situation now where our most able and skilled workers do not want to come back to the continent and help to grow and create conditions for stability and prosperity on the continent?
I think that even though you may contest it, you and I, depending on the level of your patriotism quotient, and I do patriotism in asterisks, right? Because the definition of patriotism is best left to the person who wishes to convey it. It is the fact that rationally, the conditions that enable some of the young people who are deciding to stay away to thrive on our continent are not yet available. And so when they rationally process the kind of incentive that would make them make a decision with their feet to change their location, they ultimately come with a conclusion that it's probably not yet time for them to return, which therefore means that we need to look at some of the unfavorable conditions that stand in the way of return, because having skills is one thing, but having the opportunities for the skills to be deployed is an entirely different thing, and that speaks to the matter of poor economic policies and the lack of regulatory systems and investment in the key priorities of basic goods and services that private sector need in order to grow. If our economies are not expanding, then it is not able to admit more people into it at the level of knowledge and skills that some of these young ones have. There was a young friend of mine that said, we cannot entrepreneur ourselves out of poverty.
That's it.
Governance is really so key. And governance, as we see, has become such an obstacle to the economy of Africa doing better than it's currently doing. When you look at the critical growth factors in terms of endowments, we have no business being a country, a continent that by 2030 is estimated that we will be responsible for 90% of extreme poverty in the world. It's such a no-no. And so when I look at some of
But your country, Nigeria, is projected to have more poor people than any other country in about 20 years, right?
Well, you know, that's part of it, right? Because the larger you are, the more of the share of the data you'll be responsible for.
Yes.
So, and that really should impose an important a leadership burden on those that govern. When you think that my country, Nigeria, overtook India as the country with the largest number of extremely poor people, at 93 million or thereabout, with India coming at about 60 million in current estimates of the World Poverty Lab. That's a dangerous and scary situation. And I think that sometimes we spend so much more time focused on addressing the symptoms of these serious structural state of affairs. And instead of saying, let's be bold and courageous and call a spade the spade that it is. We have failed with governance on our continent. I am tired. In fact, I got tired of saying we have failed with governance and decided that, governance is the product of politics. And in as much as I despised politics in the past, I eventually found myself getting into the arena of politics, because if you don't fix politics, it's impossible to get good governance.
Well, that's why when people say that our leaders have failed us, let me put myself in the shoes of a young Nigerian, right? There's more, this is my favorite statistic, there's more children born in Nigeria every year than in the entire European Union of 27, 28, depending on how we count it. And so I'm a young Nigerian, you are Minister of Education. If I'm gonna hold you accountable, what did Obi do for education in Nigeria?
Very brilliant question that you've just asked me. So one key thing that I saw as Minister of Education was this phenomenon of out-of-school children. When we talk about inequality and we talk about, the poverty, we really are talking about education and the lack of access to it. So, for me, education is economy. It really is. So when I saw the number of children that were out of school, even at that time, it was about 6 million. I was so vexed by it, because I thought to myself, I could have been in government and done all the other assignments that I did in government and not even been aware the level of gravity of challenge that we had, leaving the poor behind, right? So we focused on that as part of our reform agenda. In the course of one session of school year, we actually took about a little over 500,000 of those children to the classroom.
How?
And then I left. There are a series of things you have to do. You have to create the incentive. The part of the country that was most affected is the northern part of the country. So for every 4 people in school in the south, you're likely to have 1 person in school in the north. And 3 states were particularly so affected in the northeast of the country. So we had to focus on a number of policy mechanisms. Number one, we used the tool of a federal intervention that was incentivized to promote more admission of children into primary school, into basic education. We used traditional systems to get people of authority, moral authority, to actually make education an important priority for their communities.
You mean religious leaders and people?
Religious leaders, traditional rulers, and all of that. We looked at the matter of girls out not going to school, and we realized that if we could get female teachers in the classroom, it incentivized families to send their children to school. We looked at the matter of having water. If you set up like a water system in the school, it meant that families wanted their children to come. As a matter of fact, today there's a lot that is said about school feeding program.
Yes.
It started during my time. We looked at the fact that nutritionally, there is an incentive for people to want to send their children to school just to get some food to eat. But we knew that it had serious implications for capacity to absorb knowledge. So the learning factor increased significantly if children had access to nutritious meal. So we did a number of these, and then
You're saying they just go to school so they can get a free meal?
Some of them would. Oh, there are families that sent their children to school simply to be able to get that meal. But it was not just achieving the purpose of giving them food, it was also improving their capacity to process learning. And I think that the key issue for us when we look at education on our continent is, are our children learning? Are they really learning at every level? Whether it's basic education, by the way, the continent needs to take early child care education as even more important than any other thing. In fact, it is the situation where the children of the poor, majority of the children of the poor, have no access to early child care education. That is what starts off the gap. Inequality is given to the poor, the child of the poor, as early as when they are a year old, and could be put in a school, in a daycare. It's a social learning environment and all of that. But I am telling you that evidence has shown that it can determine how far that child reaches in life. Let's
come back to the solutions later, because I really want to focus on solutions before we open it up to the audience. And now we're going to switch gears to yet another high-profile former education minister. And because this is Atlantic Dialogues, we can be bilingual. Maintenant, on va parler en français. Najat, Vallaud Belkacem, vous êtes connu.
We will speak now in French. So you have been under the presidency of François Hollande in France, and you install the different digital era, and you had a lot of problem, and we don't have any problem as far as the access of school in France because it is mandatory. But what is your, let's say, positive balance of what you have been doing in France, in the French society? Welcome to everybody, and thank you for your invitation. There is a lot of subject. There's a lot of stake in the different countries. But if you are going to, let's say, ask me question for the northern countries in Europe and not the question of the access to education, we speak about France. If we speak about France, one of the major problem problem we face in the education is the struggle for inequalities. We have the PISA report of the OECD that was published, and the condition of the social condition of the parents is going to weigh a lot in the social success and in the success of our students. So it is really important for us to have at the age of 6 years the possibility to have a follow-up in the school, but it is really important to give them the same opportunity and the same chances that they will have. We have been working a lot, and PISA said that we had some progress, and then we can see a progress in this new study, but there's a lot to do. You have been also the minister of the, let's say, academic studies. If we say that 2% of the students receive state money, and this is really, they receive a grant. And so it is true, it's not functioning as well as we wish it would function, because we thought that we could import a solution and create new schools that would be, we called it priority education in France, where you can give more means, but the reality, the inequalities are everywhere in France, not only in some suburban areas, but we need to go beyond. And what is really important is that children with difficult social conditions could succeed, and we need to mix them with other children that have better conditions, because what is important is that children, they learn from their professors, but they learn also from their friends, from their all the pupils in the classroom. If poor children that has only parents that are unemployed, and all the children in the classrooms are children from the parents of unemployed parents, how can they have a hope to be a doctor, to become an architect? We need to mix them, and we have to have a mixity in the school so that we could give hope to these children to have a better future. And it is a very difficult subject, because many parents that don't have any social difficulties think that they protect their children if they send them to a private school or to a boarding school. And we need to convince the public opinion that it's going to be important for them to have the possibility to go to a school that is going to be, let's say, a mixed school where you have a paper for a richer background and a poorer background, and it's going to be a very fertile ground for giving them a new knowledge, a new approach of life. And if a pupil fails or leaves or drops out the school, it is a burden for society. We are going to give him some support, and this is going to be a life that is going to be failing. And what is really important is that I've been working for the dropouts of students, and we had a lot of young people that were dropping out the school. They had no qualification. They were going to the unemployment, and so we tried to interest them, and we had more than 80,000 young people that were leaving schools. And so we have now 90,000 people that are going back to school, and we need to fight. We need to do something. We had 150,000 people that young people that were dropping school. Now we have 90,000 that are dropping, and so it is really important for them, for their opportunity and for the possibility to go back to school. And you have been known as the minister introducing the digital era in the school. What is the lesson you can draw from the digital? When you say that I have done a lot for the digital era, I'm not a fan of the digital. I have children of 11 years, and I'm looking so that they don't spend all their time in front of a screen. I'm a mother also, and what I did is not to overexpose the children, but is to the digital era, but to explain that the children are going to live in a world where we have a digital world, a lot of automated professions, and that they have to master the machine and not be mastered by the machine. So they need to learn from the young age. They have to introduce data in the computer. They have to understand the functioning of the machine, and they believe that internet is something miraculous, is something magic, and that all the games are magic. But you have to teach them that this is all built through programs, through people, and their profession of tomorrow is going to be part of these algorithms. And this is the digital plan that we introduced in the school, and it was really important. And I was using the same formula. It's not because our children are surrounded by digital that it means that they can use it. When we were in a library, we had a lot of books all around us, but we had to learn to read to have access to these books. And so this is really important. We have to learn and teach them how to use the computer, how to use the digital era. We need to do something. We need to give to the young people the possibility. In the 3 years that I was a minister, we tried to equip the schools with digital tools to train also the profession, to build a new strategy, to have a new programs that were on these digital tools. Because when you have a tablet, it's not only to scan a book and to put it on the screen. You need to use these digital tools. And I will give you one example. We all know the question of the dyslexic children. You know that this has a relationship, the way of the different letters appears on the screens. So they don't have the same, let's say, difficulties to understand. And the digital tools, I've been using software so that we can so appear see the letter appears as the way these dyslexic children see them. And this is something completely different. And this is what we need to have. This should be a help for the professor. This should be a help for the child. And it's not going to replace the professor, and it's not going to ask less effort to the children, but it's going to help them to integrate the system. And this is, I would like also to speak about the loss of responsibility in the access of information. The roundtable, former roundtable, was very important because we had a lot of data, a lot of fake news, and we need to be very clever, and we need to see what's wrong and what's true, and what is the responsibility of the teacher or professor with the parents to train young people to distinguish the fake news and to see the real information. It was a very round table that was really important. But if I could have jumped in this round table, I would have said what is really important. What is important for the question of populism is the populism. They play on all the different prejudice, on the different ideas, and they flattered people by saying. And what is important is the role of the people that should fight against populism is to have a critical spirit, to read and just leave and drop out all the prejudice. And for example, in what I've been doing at Ipsos, which is a study group that carries out studies all over the world. Sometimes we make a lot of mistakes because we have ideas, we have preconceived ideas, we have prejudice. And if I ask in this exercise, how many migrants do you have in your country? How many foreign people do you have in your prison? How many obese people do you have in your prison? Overweight people? You would have completely wrong ideas. And so you have to fight against these prejudices and all these false ideas. And sometimes in the media, they just amplify reality. You see that you have a lot of refugees in your countries. It's not the case, but it's a false idea. It's a lot of prejudice. It's a lot of false ideas. and unfortunately, it starts in the not perhaps in the kindergarten or in the primary school, but you will have, let's say, the possibility to convince you the question of the different plotting, the different conspiration. You have a lot of theories, and the role of the school is to build a critical spirit, and that is really important. And how develop the critical spirit is to give to all the children the possibility to think for themselves, is this reasoning that I have is something that I've been hearing, or is this an intuition, or is this something that I have been doing because I learn the figures, I've been studying the case, and I can integrate the research and scientific research in my daily life and see if we can check the figures, check the data before giving an opinion. This is going to be a big victory.
This is so interesting. You are a former minister. You became an educator. Vietnam is a very different experience from France that we just talked about, is a very different experience from Nigeria, or even my own country, Togo. But what's interesting about the latest PISA rankings, and for those who don't know what the PISA rankings are, they have become the gold standard in measuring education at the secondary school level. So for instance, this year, actually it was last year, 2018, they actually tracked more than 600,000 students in 79 countries, and then they ranked the different countries. So for instance, this year, France came in at 23 out of 79, which is okay. It's the average in the OECD, but it's not amazing. However, what those of us who track PISA notice is that the countries that are always leading the pack are always Asian countries. And I know, Gregory, that you have a strong interest in Singapore. And so I'd like you to tell us why Singapore is always usually number 2 or number 3, sometimes number 1 in the PISA rankings. What is it about Singapore that is now considered the model for education worldwide? And why is it you personally have been studying it?
You are so right. You just mentioned PISA. PISA, P-I-S-A, Program for International Student Testing of OECD. OECD 2018 just came out and ranking Singapore number 2, China number 1. And PISA has a 3 dimension of measurement, mathematics, science, and reading.
Well, so let me interrupt you. I have to clarify. They didn't study all of China. They only studied about, I think, 7 or 8, or maybe even less provinces, fewer provinces in China. It's not as if they studied the entire. Yeah.
That's
so
true.
I think it's a little bit biased as well.
Yeah,
but
it's biased. It's biased, I know. But anyway, when you talk about data in in China, Vietnam, and so on, there will be a big question mark. Let me go back to Singapore, and I'm very interested in that country because of my own experience. I work with them and I follow. How come they are so fast? I love to keep souvenirs. So let me show you my ancient. In early 1960, there were no, the only source of good data for economists like us is the International Monetary Fund financial statistic. And I still keep a copy of January 1961 international finance statistic from the Fund Monetaire. There's no Singapore. I was wondering why. Because there was no such a country called Singapore in 1961. Can you imagine? The country was born out of the blue in 1965. So.
But you had a lot of the African countries which became independent in 1960.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. Yes, I used to work in the Sub-Saharan Africa, so I'm familiar with Senegal and all that. But anyway, how come they are so fast? Because in 1962, I remember, the World Bank began to publish data on Singapore, even though it was not officially a country yet. And the per capita income was $490. 25 years later, in 1987, and because I'm a professor, so I keep every year So I still keep World Bank Development Report 1989, which provide data for 1987.
What is that? Can you tell us more? What is that?
This is, I think everyone is economist. Main source of data of the world is the World Bank Development Indicators, les indicateurs de Banque mondiale. Oui. Et chaque année, il y a beaucoup de pays.
And every year,
they gave data on the three group of countries: low-income countries, middle-income countries, high-income countries. And I was so shocked to see Singapore become high-income country in 25 years. So what force did they use? Well, I'm convinced, because I follow this country. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time here to elaborate on their model. But they effectively use education and training to develop the economy. So how long do I have to summarize the?
Maybe just 2 minutes, because I want to move
okay,
to...
2 minutes.
Yeah.
2 minutes. First of all, they make decisions on conceptual basis. First, and I have not seen any country do this. First, the government decided education policy must be tailored to support economic policy. Very clear. So when they shift from import substitution to export-oriented, they inject a technical bias education system, which means an education system with a bias to emphasize mathematics, science, and technical subjects. Very clear. So that is conceptual, they do that. And so what are their instruments? Instrument of policy. 5 main instruments. First, they establish a technical department of education, the technical department of education within the Ministry of Education. Very specific, with the goal every day to follow that. And then secondly, they change indicators to monitor. Monitoring education progress is no longer emphasize literacy rates, how many school year, how many graduates, school enrollment, but how many workers, how many skilled workers available in each export manufacturing. What is their productivity level? That is to monitoring technical change. And then 3, they establish an education economic development board, very powerful to implement the government policy of export orientation. And that board also pay attention to what Madame Belkacem said, support for the children and in a difficult situation, but to promote technical change. So, and then another instrument is that they establish a technical bias curriculum injected into secondary and tertiary school. And then finally establish 4 types of secondary school: technical secondary school, vocational secondary school, commercial secondary school, and one more I forgot. Anyways, to do with
vocational,
technical.
Maybe.
Yeah, vocational. That's right.
Yeah.
So, and that is the instrument. And then
yeah.
The way impressed me very much is they foster cooperation. In many countries, we talk about cooperation, la coopération entre nous, cooperation between our 2 countries, between public and private. But specifically, they foster public education, public sector and private sector. That is one level. For example, student in technical school would study 2 years in school and then 2 years in a factory training.
That's
very
great.
difficult. That is they foster. And then they foster the link between university and industry. Industry would provide, university would provide what industry needs, what kind of talent, what kind of skill. And in turn, industry support university and give a feedback. This kind of training is not appropriate, and so on. So university has a feedback to be flexible, to adjust their curriculum every few years.
I think it's a great set of best practices that a lot of people have tried to copy. I remember when I was a student at MIT, the Singaporean students never used to have money problems. They always used to have money to go out drinking. And then we found out maybe 3 months into the class that the Economic Development Board, EDB as they call it, paid for everything. So they had a free ride. They didn't have to worry about money. So it's great because they were funded by the state and they got a free ride.
Come back to
but then,
even from the elementary, from secondary, already got a lot of support, especially in the difficult position.
But then I want to go to the chicken and egg. Singapore is now a high-income country that can afford to send these students to the best universities abroad, that can afford to train them in these different schools at home, but not every country in the global south can do that. Exactly. But then it takes me, and I want to transition to my fellow countryman, Didier, because you're Togolese, but you're also a citizen of the world like me. And I remember a conversation we had in a car in Lomé about 5 years ago, and we were writing for almost 45 minutes, and you were talking about Singapore for 30 minutes, because you've always been very much modeling yourself after Singapore, and you go there a lot. So now that you're in the business of finding top talent for top companies in Africa, what do you think Africa can learn from Singapore, and what is it about Singapore that attracts you so much?
They attract me so much because...
No, let's get to him. Let's get to him.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Claude. In fact, we did basically the opposite. Meaning, while Singapore was trying to focus on different type of education, and in the secondary system, making sure you have technical field, vocational training. In most of the African countries, we kept educating people in science, art, humanities. So you have 70% of the African students who graduate from those fields, while the economy is requiring people that have a little bit of technical skills. Meaning you cannot have a continent or countries that have massive extractive industries, that run logistics, that have agribusiness potential, and keep training people in the wrong field. Like, for instance, we hardly train 2% of Africans in agriculture. But at the same time, agriculture contributes between 15 to 25% of the GDP.
And it's 70% of the jobs across sub-Saharan Africa. 70%.
So the whole discrepancy is there. So we have conducted a survey out of 12 African countries 5 years back to find out what companies were looking for in terms of skills. And basically they say, everything dealing with sales, marketing, finance, audit, we find. Because you have a lot of those private schools right now training young Africans in those fields. But when it comes to technical, like a good electrician, a good guy that can work in a factoring company, we can't find that. So basically, we're facing a real difference between what we're producing and what the market is offering. And the other thing is that when you look at the statistic, basically, when you have like 100 Africans that have just started school, elementary school, by the time you get to secondary school, you lose 70% of them. 70%, this is huge. And from secondary to tertiary, you lose another 20%. You have less than 10% that reach the tertiary education.
It's 9% of Africans reach third tertiary.
Yes, but when they get there, the thing is that the training you provide to those guys don't match at all the market in terms of skills and competencies. So you may have a degree from tertiary education, but you can do nothing with that on the market. So basically the profile now is young Africans, well-educated, jobless. What is ridiculous. The other thing is that if I told you that you lose 70% of your people from elementary to secondary school, what do you do with the 70% people that you lost along the way? Nothing. Nothing. So those people, how do we make sure when you lose them along the way, you give them, basic skills that they can adapt into a market that is changing? Very important. The second thing, the 70% of people that you lose. If you look at the statistics, in fact, the market can afford to employ people who have basic education, secondary school education. Those people, you can always train them, give them some skills to employ them. But there are only 30% of them. So how do we make sure you go back to the 70% and provide them some skills to take them up to the secondary level in terms of capacity of, adapting, adjusting, understanding, being an entrepreneur a little bit, and provide them some of the skills, short-term skills along the way to adjust to the market needs. So those are the kind of things that we should put on the table. And then in terms of impact, you were talking about those Singaporeans who used to, study MIT scholarship. I guess you know that in most of the countries in Africa, and of course, governments are investing massively in education system. Sometimes the budget is, 20% to 40% of the budget goes into the education system. But I guess you know what? 40% of this budget goes into operating cost. 30% into scholarship, 20% in salaries, and only 10% investment. So if education is investment, you cannot afford to spend only 10% investing in education. And last thing, before I guess you move into the last question, people say that Africa will be 2 billion people by
2050.
2050. Yeah. So can you imagine how many classrooms you need to build every year? Millions of classrooms. And no country has that capacity. You cannot, build like 100,000 schools every year in the country. Impossible. So again, we should try to move a little bit away from the traditional way of teaching, thinking that you have to put all those kids into classrooms. No, you have no classrooms. And back to my point, as we don't have enough formal jobs on the markets, in some countries it's 10 to 15%, the formal jobs that we give to people. So most of the people work in the informal sector. And you know what? People who didn't pass the elementary school or first grade or whatever you want, who move into the informal sector, 90% of the people that work in the informal sector are trained on the job side, So there's no formal training to those people where we're requesting technical skills. So meaning you leave people on the road, they walk on the road, on the streets, they learn on the streets with no specific skills. So why do you want to put those people back into classrooms that you cannot build? So my point is that we should start thinking differently. This is what I call outside schools. And I can tell you, if I go on the street of Lomé, Douala, or even Johannesburg or Nairobi, and I stand in the middle of the streets, I'm like, guys, you guys who repair cars on the street, come over here. Let me explain to you in a couple of figures how you can repair a car. It's gonna be successful. Successful because people live on the street, basically work on the street. So why you want to put those people in classroom? You cannot build. So let's think differently. Let's bring expertise, skills to people where they are and make sure it's practical. They can learn from it and be on the job overnight or go back to the job with some basic skills. So the whole thing is, how do you make sure you bring those basic skills to people who have a minimum level of education, who can understand quickly, who can learn quickly, who can adjust quickly, who can adapt? South Africa, that's the problem, for instance. Back in the days, this country was, massive producer. Industry was massive in South Africa. You know, they produce cars, everything. Mm-hmm. And the factories, what type of people do you need? Low labor people, you know, low skills people. Exactly, you know, you can't fix the thing. That's it. Now they move from a low skills requirement labor to a little bit higher, moving to high value economy. And people who don't have the skills to adjust into this economy say we cannot provide jobs to those people. That's why there was a report from ILO 7 years back saying that...
The International Labour Organization.
Exactly. 1.5 million young South Africans were looking for jobs on the markets. And you had 800,000 jobs available who cannot find anybody to fill those jobs because the discrepancy between what the market is requesting and what you're producing, a huge gap. So it won't happen. And this tsunami is about to come. We need to fix this thing. Because,
but then let me stop you there, because in January 2013, McKinsey published this incredible report, which is called Education to Employment. You should download it, it's free. Just type Education to Employment McKinsey, and you'll read the report. And they studied a few countries, including Morocco, and not just South Africa. And they all have the same problem. UK, United States, they all have the same problem. They're training people for jobs that don't exist. And so there's a shortage of skills because people don't get the kind of education that the new economy actually needs. And so I want to switch maybe to Singapore again, one last time before we talk about Africa and the Global South. I want to switch to Singapore, and I want to actually speak to Najat about this, because le modèle singapourien, c'est le modèle asiatique.
The Asian model is not the panacea, the cure-all that we are describing in our media in view of the excellent classing or ranking of the Asian countries in the PISA. What are, in your opinion, the flaws and the shortfalls with this Asian model, which is considered to be, rightly so, the best top-notch the world over? Fact is, for me, PISA is somewhat like, in the economic world, the GDP. Fact is, at a certain time, we deemed or considered that the GDP was the reference indicator to measuring, to assessing the health of economies. Whereas, in reality, hasn't been always the case. You know, the GDP is born. It was during the United States economic crisis at the beginning of the 30s. We needed something to measure or to gauge the magnitude of this economic crisis, and whereby this indicator of GDP has been created. And post-Second World War, we decided this indicator will become a reference indicator to comparing or benchmarking the world economies and see where they stand. In fact, is this indicator, the GDP. Everyone has started a chase to the GDP, and it led to a growth model. In reality, has not accounted for other as important challenges as the economic question that are the societal challenges, the ecological challenges, the well-being, the happiness stakes and challenges. So much so that today, rightfully, we're asking whether to continue with the GDP or ponder on another indicator, because it has really brought us back against the wall. PISA, for me, is the same thing. We did create PISA at a certain time, saying and thinking it's going to allow us to assess all of the countries as to whether the children know how to, their capacities to write, to numerical and alphanumerical and also scientific capabilities. And we've also added the social inequalities. But now, these four seemingly very important points, do they say everything about the analysis, the country that we are analyzing? Does it say everything? My answer is no. I have nothing against Asia. I'm keen to say it, because in the last PISA, we have seen that Asian countries and China that come really at the highest rank. Is it our conclusion to say we want the same system as the China system or Chinese one? Because behind an educational system, there's a whole political, economic, democratic system, or not a cultural system. So what I am saying and what I wrote on the topic is say, let's beware. Let's beware not to make this indicator the alpha and omega that would cause us to stray from what we're looking for our children and students. And maybe there is a local dimension in education. We should not do likewise in the US and Morocco. I'm talking about the critical spirit. In France, there are a lot of countries also, but there are countries where we have worked on the topic, and we have given it more importance. I heard what my colleague was saying a moment ago, and the vocational training and a technical training and adapt education to the needs of the economy. It is a noble intention, indeed, but we can also consider that education does not only need to adapt to the needs of the economy, because if we only adapt to the needs of the economy, what would happen? We will not be making any philosophy, no ethics. Whereas we haven't talked about that topic, but we are now going towards a more and more automated labor market. I'd like us to talk about it. We already know, you've talked about the McKinsey report. We know that de minimis, or at least 70% of the jobs are going to be impacted by the task automation. We also know that in 10 years from now, everything having to do with repetitive tasks, be they manual work, train, driver, pilot, accounting, human resources, all going to come in the hands of machines. I'm asking now, what are the competencies and the skills that we have to develop for tomorrow for men to master in the heart of the machine, and the machine does not go snafu? And the philosophy question is very important. Does PISA master and evaluate the capacity of countries to develop in the philosophy and ethics? The answer is no. Many microphones, sir. Thank you. But the question of ethics, it is very early fit in the school system. But once again, it's not a criticism against those who do PISA today, because they're of good quality. That's not a problem. It's us, how really leave ourselves to be blinded by a single sole indicator. And after that, we apply our policies to run after this indicator, and it becomes a little too belated or too late to change path. Whereas maybe it is easier to change indicator. This is the same question of the GDP as we on PISA, and after that we will change topic because we've talked about PISA as usual. But the Scandinavian countries are very well ranked. Finland, for instance, and Scandinavian countries are well ranked because they massively invest in the training of teachers, and they're always well ranked, which is better than other OECD countries. Obi, je vous passe la parole maintenant.
Is the biggest country in Africa. We always talk about Nigeria. Every panel I'm on, it's always going to be about Nigeria when it comes to Africa. And I think it's important for you to talk about some of the solutions that you see to this education quandary that we're discussing. Maybe you can start with specific things that you think we can do in Nigeria that perhaps could be exported to other low-income countries in Africa.
I think that it is important to validate the point that my co-panelists made. When I became Minister of Education, I needed to find a global benchmark that would support the way that we were thinking about the problems of education. So the first thing that we did was to say, what kind of philosophy of education are we going to work on? And we decided that it would be education that builds character, aptitude, and enables the graduates of our school system meet their needs and the needs of the society. So we actually called our education reform, We Can. And this was way
yes,
beyond,
we can.
It was way before Obama.
Okay.
It was way before Obama. But we called it We
He
Can.
copied you, maybe.
I don't know. I would be earning so much if I registered. So we called it We Can. And it meant we educate for character, aptitude, and our needs. And by designing our education from that philosophical premise, we decided to look for the country that most reflected what we were trying to do. It was Singapore. And so one of the key things that we did in our reform was that we decided that the private sector is critical to becoming a globally competitive economy. And if the private sector is key to being a globally competitive economy, we needed the private sector to be in the room in policy making for education. So we gave private sector a seat in policy making for education. The second thing we did was that we looked at the evidence that was clearer about the impact of the quality of teacher to learning outcomes. And so we did a survey of existing teacher stock that we had, and it showed clearly that the quality of teachers in our classrooms were definitely not going to give us the kind of learning outcomes that the children needed in order to be functional members of society. So we designed new programs, very fast-track programs, to adapt the skills of the teachers to the new levels of learning that the children needed. The third thing we did was that we looked at the curriculum, and we realized that the curriculum was designed with the British educational model and mindset. It was to train them to get work in the public service. It wasn't going to help us, because already at that time, we were having more than 2 million of our children coming out of school and finding no jobs. And so what were we going to do with curriculum? We decided that the gaps were critical thinking, entrepreneurship, and technology. So we had to begin to adjust our curriculum at all the levels to reflect this. Then we sort of had this foresight that technology was going to be big. And when I looked at the fact that the economy was not fast expanding as it could, but I could see clearly that technology had the capacity to be exponential in its opportunities for children. So we decided to enter into a relationship with Microsoft, Cisco, Oracle, and we asked them to establish academies in the country. Now, if you looked at the kind of reforms that we carried out, it was reforms modeled after some of the things I learned by looking at what Singapore was doing or had in fact done already. But guess what? A lot of those reforms, by the way, what you said about technical education, and I'm talking to you, what you said about technical education.
Gregory, Minister Gregory, yeah.
Yes,
yes,
innovation.
Technical.
We added a new level of certification in our country.
Yeah.
We call it Innovation Enterprise Institutions and Vocational Enterprise Institutions. We designed this to be programs that the private sector in industry actually ran, and ours was to accredit, to give them the accreditation and to work with the curriculum to give it the quality and content. But they were designing what kind of skills they needed out of the graduates of those programs to supply labor to industry. So all of these things that we did, what was the tragedy? And that will get you back to where I started from. The tragedy was that as soon as I left as Minister of Education, the new Minister of Education is appointed. What do you think the new Minister of Education does?
Get rid of everything you did. Same as you.
So there's a political context within which people who care about education work. And if that political context is so unstable like the water, it is a disservice to the children of the poor.
Yeah, but then let me stop you there, because your president, your former president, Olusegun Obasanjo, was on stage, and he said, and a lot of us laughed when he said he was BBC, right? He was born before computer. But then he pulled out his cell phone, and so there's no denying that any minister of education in Nigeria now would have to understand that this digital technology is a huge opportunity in a country that is producing so many children.
But it goes beyond the digital. You see, the fundamentals are important. And for you to be able to solve any problem, you've got to go to the, this whole cause and correlation. We have to master it. When you look at what data is telling us about our continent, look, just imagine the fact that we are a continent still growing at 3-4%. We're not even scratching the surface that gets you to the inflection point where you begin to tackle poverty big time, right?
Yes.
Now, for you to be able to expand growth to that level and to make it broad, you need a level of productivity and competitiveness that can only come through a deliberate attention to the issues of education. And to think of education not merely as something you do, but it becomes the core, the heart of your economic strategy. In most of our countries, that hardly happens. A minister of education is appointed, and it's just like you're a minister of education. And then the people running the economy are busy running the economy. But the model that we must have is where education is the new economy. As a matter of fact, what I say is that human capital is the new. I said in my thinking that education is the new oil for a country like ours. Oil is soon going to deplete anyway, and even if it didn't deplete, the world is going to kiss it goodbye and perhaps leave us to drink it. And then you look at human capital. Human capital has to be seen as the new economy. And for Africa, I've been in Europe recently, and all the time that Europeans gather, they are discussing migration policy. Suddenly, Europe's relationship with Africa has reduced to migration policy. What a shame. You know, what a real shame. Because if Africa got its demographic opportunity right and really positioned itself as a talent hub, ultimately, as the demographic shifts happen in Europe, we wouldn't need to, their own policy, nobody would tell them to drop it, because they would be looking for the talents that are skilled to be at the heart of the next level of structural economic change that Europe also needs to embrace.
And so I want to stop you there because I know we have a hard stop in 15 minutes, and I want to get as many questions from the audience as possible. But, you know, and what you're saying about, you know, Europe and everything, and I want you, Didier, to speak about this World Bank Centers of Excellence that you kind of really feel has been really interesting from an education perspective. And again, I'm sorry I have to mention this example because we're always mentioning examples of white people coming to save us in Africa. This is not what we're talking about. But you felt that there was something really interesting with these centers of excellence. And can you tell us maybe in 2-3 minutes what it is before we open it up to the public?
Yeah, no, definitely. What my sister Obi was saying that, you know, human capital should be the heart of our whole strategies and the heart of the infrastructure. This is the basic one. And to come back to technical skills, because it's tough for like private sector to build a technical university or technical training center, because you have to equip it, you know, put a laboratory. It's quite expensive. So the World Bank and some government in Africa, and currently we're supporting 15 countries, decided that some of the technical universities in Africa willing to grow faster in terms of equipment, industrial relationship, could be part of this program and build African centers of excellence, but existing centers. And the whole idea is to make sure we bring private sector on board, we revise the curricula to make sure they match the requirement of the industries. Of course, gender is part of the element of those centers. You know, they have to train as much as women as they can. And of course, the job access to market of those people that are trained in those centers should be high enough to make sure what they are doing in those universities makes sense for the markets. And so we have 25 universities right on the program in West and Central Africa, and reaching out to East Africa as ACE2, African Centers of Excellence 2. So I think it's a way to engage private sector, public sector, and DFIs. Instead of talking about
DFIs, maybe you want to qualify.
Yeah, the development financial institutions, where Sister Obi knows very well.
Yes.
So instead of talking about migration, we can probably talk about education, about building skills, engaging private sector with public sector, and engaging industries, our universities. So
Okay.
far, it's quite a successful program, and
Okay.
other universities will engage.
Okay, thank you. So now I want to basically just tell you about a little cloud program that we have on the Spot Me. And we have a question before this panel, which is, what does the classroom of the future need more of? And I'm hoping that some of you can actually answer this question. And then from there, I want to take a few questions from the audience, maybe 2 or 3 in the 16 minutes. Well, I stole 5 minutes from you, sorry. In the 16 minutes that we have left, please introduce yourself before you ask the question, in French or English.
Yeah, my name is Marcus Freitas. I'm from Brazil. And I was listening to the panel and the discussion. And there are 2 things that I'd like to say that I was thinking about. I live in China now, so I understand why China does so well. For 3 reasons. 1, there is still a lot of respect for professors and teachers, something that we have lost. And I can always tell that example, always with the authority, the second person that sits close to the authority is the professor, no one else. So we have lost that because we are thinking about critical thinking, and I think we need to go back to restoring the figure and the importance of the professor. Second thing is that most of the politicians in China send their children to public schools. And in my country, if you make $1,000, you're thinking about sending your child to a private school. So there is no pressure on the private schools.
In this country as well, Morocco as well.
So that's a problem. If your politicians and your middle class, upper middle class, is sending their children to private schools and not public schools, your public schools are going to deteriorate anyway.
Let's ask, are there any politicians in the room who send their children
Well,
to...
we can ask the panel.
Yeah, let's ask here.
Yeah, but that's an interesting thing for you to remember. That's the challenge that we have. And third is that, we talk a lot about critical thinking, but if you look into Singapore and China, what they're doing is that they are creating the future, right? They're creating the future, creating jobs for the future. And I'll just give you an example. I went to China Petroleum University, 15,000 students learning about everything related to the petroleum. I go to Brazil and we don't find that. So that kind of specialized knowledge is really what is going to create a cutting edge for them in the future. So I think, why we're still thinking about, that's the discussion that I see in my country, we're talking about all these things about education, ideology, non-ideology, we're just wasting time. So how do we secure that our children, or your grandchildren, will have a country that is decent and they'll have jobs? Because that's what it comes to the end.
That's a great and very long question.
Thank you. Sorry for that.
And so maybe, who wants to volunteer for that question?
I think that the points that he made are very clear. The only thing that I would say is that ultimately education is local, but it is designed in a way to ensure that people are consistent with the values and the kinds of anchors on which their institutions will be built. But they must have a mind of being competitive. And that competitiveness therefore means that at every turn in the society, when structurally things change, education administrators must be knowledgeable enough to anticipate those changes. And even if they fell behind the changes, they must have the kind of political context that enables them to quickly catch up and overtake on that context. The second thing is, you talked about the professor sitting by the authorities. The truth is that the whole world has become anti-intellectual. In many ways, part of what we're struggling with is a society where it is perfectly okay to be enamored of ignorance. And that is dangerous for us, particularly on our continent, because the basic foundation on which you can even build the capacity to take a technical problem and solve it is absent for the large number of children that are still out of school, or for the 3 out of every 5 that are in school but are not learning. We have very serious situation. So my prognosis on this is that if we do not see education as the heart of everything about our development, we're not going to make any progress. So we're stuck in low equilibrium growth. We're stuck in a situation where our population is going to continue to grow. Instead of taking the benefit of that growth, it's going to be a demographic disaster for us. We need to become the what do you call it? The reform constituency for education for our continent. We need a strong reform constituency for education. It doesn't exist. There are constituencies for different kinds of things on the continent, but where is the strong constituency for education? And yet, this is what will determine whether the era of disruptive technology will worsen our condition on the continent. It's a question seeking for answers, but that answer would come when we have the people with political courage to be able to take on the political context within which these priorities of making sure that through education we can offer each child on this continent the opportunity of a lifetime. Because after all, the difference between the person who is well and okay and the one who is not is access to opportunity. And the best opportunity you can access is education.
Thank you. I think we had a question.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
just one word. There were some things I agreed and other things I didn't. But I just would like to come back to the question of respect to teachers, because I think that is a real topic. And it's true that in our societies, teachers are suffering to be less and less respected. But I would like to say something, because there is a mistake that is often done on this topic. This lack of respect doesn't come from the children, from the students. This lack of respect comes from the society, comes from the parents. The more well-educated they are, and the less they respect the teachers, because it's like, okay, I already know you don't have anything to teach me, okay? So from the parents, from the media, from the politicians. So we all have to ask ourselves what is our part of responsibility, but it's not the question of the students or the children. So I think it's a good question, but don't mistake in the way you raise it.
I think there was a question here.
Excusez-moi, Mohamed Ilyakoubi.
Mohamed Ilyakoubi. I'm a university consultant. I'm also the chair of the Professional Organization of Accountants in Morocco. I have a question based on 3 main items. Could you please summarize your question, because we have lots of hands hanging. First question is about transition on education and training in Africa. Why are we lagging behind? Why aren't we able to design a proper education that can be up to the challenges of globalization? Why aren't we autonomous? And I don't understand why the pre-scholar stage is not functioning. Why are we waiting children to have 6-7 years before sending them to school? This pre-scholar period is very important for children, and unfortunately we depend on archaic education, Quranic schools, religious schools in the first 2-3 years, but this is not education. I'm sorry. We need a real pre-scholar, let's say, structure. Second important thing, digitalization. Once again, a few countries have succeeded, but their number is too limited, only 4 or 5 in Africa. I'm talking about Africa, but I could talk about also Latin American or Asian countries. They're also suffering from this huge problem. Why aren't we able to ensure digital transition using the ITC? for education, but also in order to improve public services in general. And here I'd like to talk about the following. We have economies where tertiary services are predominant. Why? Not because you have lots of private services, but because we have a very strong public administration. And our countries, they're not able actually to foster the private sector. Hence my question, how can digitalization help us fight against the problems that we have, problems such as corruption? Digital tools can, I think, reduce corruption in the relationship that you have with the public service, because if you use a machine, you can mitigate all the corruption effects, in my view. What kind of advice can we give to African countries, and also to Morocco? How can we put ethics when the state provide public services to taxpayers, to citizens, and to businesses in general? Who would like to answer to this very complex matter about pre-scholar, about digital transition, and how to fight against corruption? Well, why the digital era is not succeeding in all countries. Actually, I'm part of a club of former ministers of education throughout the world. We've been looking at experiences in different regions. In order to answer your question, actually, the digital tools that have been tested in several number of countries very often have not been assessed by independent studies. So there's a lack of independent studies that can provide the evidence that this tool works, that this tool doesn't work. Since it does not exist, the malfunctioning tools are still there in the market. Secondly, whenever a player, educational, let's say a player launches a new digital tool, it's very complicated to, let's say, to extend the experiments. The experiments are too fragmented, too limited, so they do not reflect what can be actually done at the general level. And most of those experiments made by startups are actually startups that do not work the real, players, the teachers, the students. I think there's only one country, I have looked at the European continent. The only country where I have found something very efficient is Finland. There are teachers throughout their educational career, they are able to step out to work in a digital startup, maintain their status, and the outcome is that this teacher, with their knowledge, they can enrich the digital tools, and that's how they can become more efficient. One last question. We have 3 minutes left. Last question. Morning, I'm Fatim Zahra from Morocco. The world has been changing constantly since 1920 to 2020. Everything has changed except education. If you get into a classroom, nothing has changed substantially. We're thinking of new solutions to the education, but those who do so are, most of the cases, politicians. So my question is the following. There are lots of people changing the world, all those working in the tech technologies, organizations. They can come up with disruptive solutions. They can actually create things that have a large-scale impact. Now, if during 1 year or two, instead of thinking of how we can change education, why not making sure that those politicians work in a startup and see how it works? How can we move then from a very limited impact to a very large impact? Because actually there are lots of very small initiatives, but that can't be scaled up at the African level. So how can we change the mindset of those who make the decisions and not just continue thinking of how to change our own mindset or how to change the education? how can we somehow educate also those who make the decisions? And this is where I think the main issue is. I mean, this has to do with the digital matter. The African University, Digital University was a very good idea, but it was not successful. But there is a cultural dimension indeed. Some parents in Africa, French-speaking Africa, when you tell them your kid is going to study at home with a tablet, they will tell you no. Studying means going to school. I won't enable my kid to study remotely. This is a social and cultural dimension. There's also a learning dimension. Of course, there are lots of digital solutions, but they're not customized. You know, you can't just, copy the pages of a book and put them in a tablet. There's a learning curve of the digital tools. And of course, public authorities are completely disconnected. If you go to university, books of economy are books of 40 years ago. We're not talking about Airbnb, we're not talking about GAFA, we're not talking about digitalization. So students are learning things from 40 years ago, as if you would get into a school classroom in 1920. And even the teachers, I can tell you this. We went to a conference and the president said, we have teachers at the university teaching, master's classes, but they only have a level A grade. How can you teach something to students, master students? So there's a disconnection between the skills of the teachers in some countries and the reality and the needs of the students. And once again, there are going to be so many young Africans in the market. You have to think in terms of digital tools, even though the access to internet is not that developed. But just think of the impact if you delocalize the knowledge, if you make it available in a very practical manner. That's how you can fight against the problems we have in the educational era. It's also a matter of transmission. Mr. Azoulay, do you have a last word on this to conclude? Because it's a major topic. The transmission. There were lots of things, indeed, very interesting things, but I think he has indeed something to say. Give him the microphone. I may be just a little bit provocative. It has been a very passionate panel. I listened to what Najat said about the GDP and this new polarization based on PISA and Shanghai, etc. Think of parameters, think of the inputs of the PISA classification, and think of our challenges in all nations, in all countries, archaism, regression, and so on and so forth. There is no criteria whatsoever that would include that very important thing, the best examples. The problem is that the best examples are not providing any solutions. And I think also Najat said something, and the gentleman next to her, the ability of finding jobs, but not according to the definitions that we are familiar with. And at the same time, there are so many things to do. Think of how culture is marginalized in all those programs. In the approach that you have developed, why not promoting the school of life, the school of tradition, the school of family? I think we would in a better position in the face of the future challenges. I can tell you stories about my own city where I was born. Those kids who were raised in a society where thinking is important. You can produce different types of individuals. But unfortunately, in all the thinking, in all the reflections that we have, these aspects are not taken into account. While there are very clear evidence that responses are there, but nor Pisa nor Shanghai are actually provide. Thank you very much, Mr. Azulai, for your explanations on transmission.
As to what the future classroom actually needs more of, I don't know if anybody actually went through with that exercise. Please, can you show it to us in the world of diversity, critical thinking, languages, empathy, leadership, economic values? With that being said, I want to thank our wonderful panel, Ms. Obi Ezekwesili. Please, a round of applause. Ms. Najat Vallaud Belkacem, Mr. Didier Acouetey, Mr. Gregory Nguyen. Thank you so much. It's the Education Quandary. Wonderful.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our last plenary for the day. We invite you now to join us at your assigned breakout dinners. Passes will be heading to your dinner venues promptly. Please follow direction from your host in the grand foyer. Please make sure you collect all your